Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, as a result of the greed, recklessness, and illegal behavior by a small number of executives on Wall Street, the American people today are suffering through the most serious economic conditions that we have seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Since the recession started in December of 2007, 8.4 million Americans have lost their jobs, and while the official unemployment rate is 9.7%, according to the latest Gallup poll, nearly 20% of the American workforce is either unemployed or underemployed. In other words, we have people who are working, but they're working 20 hours when they need to be working 40 hours. Further, long-term unemployment is soaring. Today, over 6 million Americans have been unemployed for over 6 months, the highest on record. So this is not a situation where people are just losing their jobs and a few weeks later they go out and get another job. People are losing their jobs and they cannot find another job, which is why it is so important that we extend unemployment benefits, and so reprehensible that there are those in this chamber who have resisted that effort. Mr. President, today there are fewer jobs in the United States than there were in the year 2000, even though the workforce has grown by 12 million since that time. Today, we now have the fewest manufacturing jobs than at any time since April 1941, 8 months before the start of World War II. Today, home foreclosures are the highest on record, turning the American dream of home ownership into an American nightmare for millions of our people. Further, and we don't discuss this enough, Mr. President, in the United States today, we have the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth. And that means that while the middle class is in rapid decline, while poverty is increasing, the gap between the people on top and everybody else is wider than in any other country on any other major country on earth, and growing wider. The reality is that today, the top 1% now earns more income than the bottom 50%, and the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. Meanwhile, while the folks on Wall Street give themselves tens and tens of millions of dollars in bonuses for having destroyed our economy, the United States has by far the highest rate of childhood poverty among major countries. Almost a quarter of our children today are dependent on food stamps. Approximately 19% of our kids are living in poverty, and 1 out of 4 kids in the United States, in order not to be hungry, are dependent on food stamps. Mr. President, while the Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke recently talked about how, quote unquote, the recession is likely over, end of quote, I would urge him to meet with America's blue-collar workers, or those few people left who do manufacturing in this country. As the Boston Globe reported several months ago, quote, the recession has been more like a depression for blue-collar workers, who are losing jobs much more quickly than the nation as a whole. The nation's blue-collar industries have slashed 1 in 6 jobs since 2007. 1 in 6 jobs since 2007, compared with about 1 in 20 for all industries, leaving scores of the unemployed competing for the rare job opening in construction or manufacturing, with many unlikely to work in those fields again. Up to 70% of unemployed blue-collar workers have lost jobs permanently, meaning their old jobs won't be there when the economy recovers. That is a staggering fact. So when you talk about the recession hurting people, it is hurting some of the people who are already in the most serious trouble, people who don't have a whole lot of money to begin with. Now, that is what is going on in the real world today. But sadly and significantly, what's going on today simply is an acceleration of what was going on the previous 8 years. It's not like, oh, times were good, middle class was doing well, and oops, the reckless behavior of Wall Street plunged us into a major recession. What is not talked about enough is that this continues and accelerates a trend that has been going on for a number of years. During the 8 years of the Bush administration, here is what happened. Over 8 million Americans slipped out of the middle class and into poverty. Over 7 million Americans lost their health insurance. You know, Mr. President, our Republican friends are vehemently objecting to us going forward in terms of health care. When they had the power, when they had the presidency, when they had control over the House and the Senate, during that period, millions of Americans lost their health insurance. Health care costs. Do you recall them coming forward and saying, we've got to do something about this crisis? More and more people losing their insurance, more people unable to afford their insurance. I didn't hear a word. But now they're very vocal. Now they're very loud. Stop it. We can't do anything. No, no, no. They had their chance. And it's sad to say that right now all they could do is play the obstructionist role and be the party of no. Mr. President, and I make this point not to just relive history, but to understand where the anger comes from today. It is not just that in the last year and a half, millions more people lost their jobs, lost their health insurance. During the 8 years of President Bush, median household income declined by over $2,100. $2,100. So people come out of that period from 2000 and 2008 staggered. They're earning less than they did before that decade began, and then they walk into the greed and recklessness of Wall Street, which creates a massive recession. Mr. President, the Washington Post reported last January that, and I quote, the past decade was the worst for the U.S. economy in modern times. That's before the Wall Street crash. Let me say it again. Washington Post, last January, the past decade was the worst for the U.S. economy in modern times. It was, according to a wide range of data, a lost decade for American workers. A lost decade for American workers. There has been zero net job creation since December 1999. Can you imagine that? Since December 1999, the country has grown 0 jobs. Middle-income households made less in 2008 when adjusted for inflation than they did in 1999. And the number is sure to have declined further during a difficult 2009. So there you got it. You want to know why people are angry, why people are frustrated, why people are pointing their finger at Washington and at us and saying, hey, we are in trouble. Massive unemployment, real wages have gone down, people are working incredibly hard if they're lucky enough to have a job, and at the end of the day, they're worse off than they were 10 years ago. Mr. President, according to a September 2009 article in U.S. Today, and this is really quite incredible, and these are statistics that we just don't talk about enough. From 2000 to 2008, middle-class men experienced an 11.2% drop in their incomes. Can you imagine that? From 2000 to 2008, middle-class men experienced an 11.2% drop in their income, which amounts to a reduction of $7,700 after adjusting for inflation. So you imagine that. You work hard for 8 years, and at the end of those 8 years, you've lost $7,700. Even worse, Mr. President, the USA Today article goes on to report that many age groups are poorer today than they were in the 1970s. We talk about the American dream in that parents work hard so that their kids will do better than they did. Well, we are moving in the wrong direction. Today, the average American worker, or at least millions of American workers, in terms of inflation accounted for dollars, are worse off than they were in the 1970s. And Mr. President, without going through all of the reasons why the middle class is collapsing and poverty is increasing, without going into great length about the growing gap between the very rich and everybody else, I think it is important to say a few words about our good friends on Wall Street. People who have made it clear to everybody in this country that the only thing they care about is making as much money as they possibly can in any way they possibly can. Recently, in the last several years, 40% of all profits in this country went to the relatively few people in the financial industry, 40% of the profits. We have seen hedge fund managers and owners earning billions of dollars. We've seen CEOs of major Wall Street banks being worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. All the while, the middle class collapse. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty. Millions of people are losing their health insurance. You know, we talk about people living in a gated community, people living in very, very expensive homes, protected by armed guards and gates, driving around in their chauffeured limousines, getting into their private jets, having no clue about what's going on in the real world. That's what Wall Street is about. They are engaged in producing esoteric financial instruments which very few people understand, which are producing nothing real in the real world. They're not creating real jobs. They're not creating real products, real services. They are a gambling casino whose function in life is to make money for the people who own that casino. Now, after we deal with health care, and I hope we can finish that up as soon as possible, the issue of financial reform is going to come into this chamber. And I hope very much that we can respond to the frustration and the anger of the American people about what Wall Street has done and promise them through legislation that those people will never again get away with the crimes that they have committed against the working families of this country. And let me just suggest a few of the areas that I think a serious and real financial reform bill should address. Mr. President, every week I hear from constituents in Vermont, and I suspect you hear from constituents in Illinois, who say, how in God's name can these large financial institutions who we bailed out with our tax dollars now charge us 25 or 30% interest rates on their credit cards? I hear this all of the time. And let's be clear, when a large bank and about two-thirds of the credit cards in this country are issued by the four largest financial institutions in America, when a large financial institution is charging a working American 25 or 30% interest rates on their credit cards, we have got to be very clear in calling that what it is. That is loan sharking. That is usury. That is immoral. You know, the Bible, all of the major religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all of them talk to the fact that usury is immoral, that you cannot lend money at excessive rates to struggling people who need that money to survive. And that's what's happening today. The loan sharks today are not gangsters out on the street who break kneecaps. These are guys in three-piece suits who in some cases make hundreds of millions of dollars a year by stealing money from working people through excessively high interest rates. The middle class is collapsing, poverty is increasing, and often, in order to deal with the day-to-day needs of a family, whether it is food, whether it's gas to get to work, whether it's money to heat your home, people are using credit cards. And to be charged 25 or 30% is simply immoral in my view, and it's something that has got to be eliminated. As you know, a number of states all over the country have passed usury laws. But as a result of the Marquette Supreme Court decision a number of years ago, these credit card companies go to certain states, South Dakota, elsewhere, where there are no usury laws, charge anything they want all over the country. They have nullified state usury laws. Well, you know what? We need a national usury law. We've got to say straight out, it is immoral, it is wrong to be charging working people 20, 25, 30, 35 or more % interest rates on their credit card. And as part of any serious finance reform legislation, the American people have got to know we're going to end usury. My view is, and I have introduced legislation to this effect, that we should do for the private banks what we do with credit unions right now, 15% max, except under certain circumstances, which now would take them up to 18%. No more 25%, no more 30%, no more 40, 50%, no more payday lending. We're going to end that. And I think that has got to be incorporated into any serious financial reform legislation. Mr. President, any part of any serious finance reform bill has got to deal with the need to increase transparency at the Federal Reserve. I will never forget, about a year ago, the chairman of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, came before the Budget Committee on which I serve, and I asked him if he could tell us which banks received trillions of dollars in zero interest or almost zero interest loans. Trillions of dollars, placing the taxpayers of this country at risk. And Mr. Bernanke said, no, not going to tell you that. Not going to tell you that. Well, we've introduced legislation to demand that he tells us. The American people have a right to know which financial institutions have received trillions of dollars in loans. And one of the great scams of our time, Mr. President, we want to talk about welfare. This is a beaut. These are welfare queens. We've heard that expression before. These guys are getting zero interest loans from the Fed, or maybe they're paying 0.5%, and then they go out and lend that money to the federal government, and they buy government securities at 3.5% or 4%, having taken money from the government at 0% or 0.5%. How's that? You got a nice spread there. You got a 3% spread on that. The money that you're lending out is guaranteed by the faith and credit of the United States, never once failed. That's a pretty good deal. Give you money at zero interest, and you go out and guaranteed money at 3%, not a bad deal. That's welfare for billionaires. And that is unacceptable, and we have a right to know which financial institutions are engaged in that, and most importantly, we've got to end that right now. So we need transparency at the Fed, and they cannot continue to operate in that kind of secrecy. Mr. President, we have also got to end the too big to fail phenomenon. Here's a fact that I think many Americans don't know, and that is that while we bailed out Wall Street because institutions were too big to fail, and if they went down, they would take the whole economy with them, well, guess what? A year and a half later, 3 out of the 4 largest financial institutions are bigger today than they were before we bailed them out. Now, what am I missing here? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And I think not only that, not only are they a greater danger to the economy today than they were before, but there's something else that's going on which we also don't talk about too much. Maybe as the only independent in the Senate who was not a Democrat or Republican, maybe it's my job to be raising these issues, but somebody's got to raise them. And that is the top 4 financial institutions in this country have enormous amounts of economic power over this country. As I mentioned earlier, they issue 2/3 of all the credit cards in this country. Does that sound like a very competitive situation to you? 4 large financial institutions issue 2/3 of the credit cards in America. I don't think that's a healthy thing for our economy. So not only do we have to end these huge financial institutions because they are too big to fail, but we also have to allow for increased competition within the banking industry and doing away with this huge concentration of ownership. Not only do they top 4, which is JP Morgan Chase, the Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup, not only do they issue 2/3 of the credit cards, they also issue half of the mortgages in America. I don't think that is a healthy state for this country, and I think we've got to start breaking these guys up. And the last point that I would make, maybe is the most important, is that in Vermont and all over this country, small and medium-sized businesses are in desperate need of capital, of affordable loans, so that they can better produce the products and services that they need to, and in fact create the kinds of jobs that our economy desperately needs. I'm sure the case is similar in Illinois, but I can tell you in Vermont, you have small businesses coming into my office and saying they just can't get the credit that they need to expand and create jobs. So you got Wall Street operating as a gambling casino, selling and playing with esoteric financial instruments. It is time they started investing in the real productive economy and started creating jobs. So, Mr. President, let me conclude by just saying this. The American people are hurting. They are suffering through a terrible, terrible moment economically in our country. People are wondering whether for the first time in the modern history of America, our kids will have a lower standard of living than their parents. This is the reverse of what the American dream is about. People are wondering how they're going to be able to afford to send their kids to college, how they're going to pay for child care, how they're going to pay the mortgage on their home when they're either losing their jobs or their real wages are going down. And they're looking to Washington. I think they are becoming increasingly frustrated by the Republican Party of no, which seems to gain satisfaction every time they could stop legislation which attempts to address real problems, whether it's health care, whether it's jobs, whether it's extending unemployment benefits. It's no, no, no from the Republicans. And American people are beginning to catch on that there have been a record number of filibusters in this session, a record-breaking number of obstructionist tactics. And I think what the American people are saying is, hey, Congress, Mr. President, we are hurting. We need action, or else the middle class of this country is just not going to survive. And I think, as difficult as it is, as much as we understand that when we deregulated Wall Street, they spent $5 billion in 10 years in lobbying and campaign contributions, making sure that Congress did what Wall Street wanted. In 2009, Wall Street spent $300 million on lobbying. I don't know how you spend $300 million on lobbying. 100 members of the Senate, 435 in the House. I mean, just an astronomical number. These guys will spend and spend and spend to make sure that Congress does nothing to prevent them from going on their merry ways of doing whatever they want without any serious kind of regulation. So, Mr. President, in these very, very difficult moments, I would hope that the Senate and the House will summon up the courage to do the job that we were elected to do and what we're paid to do, and that is to represent working families in the middle class and not just big money and Wall Street. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the well, I'm not going to note. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that amendment number 3548 be designated as a prior amendment.
Without objection.
Mr. President, with that, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr.